Thank you so much. Tonight I'm going to be talking about Al-Qaeda's grand strategy. But before I begin to do that, I perhaps should justify this topic. I might have to, for instance, define what precisely is meant by grand strategy, and also to give you a little bit of understanding of where their grand strategy fits in the organization as a whole. Before I even do that, I should point out to you that this topic is intertwined with every single policy debate that is currently ongoing in Washington, D.C. over the issue of Al-Qaeda. The five topics that I've put up here are, in fact, hotly debated in Washington today. And it might seem very strange to some of you in the audience who remember this debate from back in 2001 that we're still talking about who is Al-Qaeda. But in fact, the question of what is Al-Qaeda, who is Al-Qaeda, is still hotly debated. The question of what are these affiliates that everybody talks about and what the relationship is with Al-Qaeda, whether there's any command and control between the affiliates and Al-Qaeda, and what's the proper way to deal with this group, and can we actually win against them? All five of these questions are deeply intertwined with the question of Al-Qaeda's grand strategy, as I'll show you tonight. And I hope to bring some clarity to all of these debates tonight as well. So what is grand strategy, and how does it help us to understand where our policy should be at when dealing with Al-Qaeda? Well, first of all, grand strategy would be the highest level understanding or highest level plans that an organization or country has for dealing with a specific problem. So you have grand strategy would be in some ways equivalent to policy. But policy often is put as simply a set of objectives. For instance, under the Bush administration, a policy objective was to spread democracy or democratization around the Middle East, right? But that doesn't tell you how precisely you're going to go about doing this. And a grand strategy has much more to it than just an objective. It gives you also the sorts of ways and means, the plans that one might use in order to achieve those policy objectives. Strategies are underneath that, and that would be like military, political, economic, diplomatic, all of those things that are necessary to work out in fine detail in order to achieve your grand strategy. And then operational art and tactics are under those as well, working out in far greater detail, all the way down to individuals, perhaps on a battlefield, or individuals in one embassy and what they're supposed to be doing every day in order to achieve the grand strategy. Now, here's the thing that many people argue. Can grand strategy even exist? Can people really have these ideas about what they're going to achieve, sit down and work out a finely detailed plan, and then implement it in any serious way? If you look at the United States, many people have said that we've had several grand strategies. There was Manifest Destiny, which was this grand strategy for expansion of the country. There was the grand strategy that was current during the Cold War that included things like deterrence and containment. But others say that those were simply pieces and parts of a real grand strategy. They didn't include a fully worked out idea about economics, about what you would do with your scientific knowledge, your industry, and other things like that. And that never in the history of the United States have we actually had a grand strategy. Others say we have had them. They've been implemented very poorly, only piecemeal, but at least we had them somewhere behind the scenes working in order to shape or help us to shape our policies. But grand strategies in general, then, are contested, and people argue about whether they can even exist. And as you shall see in a bit, there's a huge argument about whether Al-Qaeda, as a non-state actor, not even possessing really territory, can have a grand strategy that it's actually seeking to achieve. But if you take a look at the different pieces, parts of a grand strategy or any strategy, how they're worked out, I'm going to hopefully prove to you tonight that Al-Qaeda not only has a sort of theoretical grand strategy that they've written down, that they've talked about, that they sort of hope or aspire to achieve, but in fact, over the past 20 years, since the 1990s, they've been actually seeking to achieve parts of them and have, in fact, achieved bits and pieces of their grand strategy and still aspire to achieve the rest of it over the next 200 years, which is the time frame they give for their grand strategy. Now that's grand, right? So here is how most people think about planning and grand strategic planning, that you must first of all begin with an objective, that is the ends that you want to achieve. That's the policy objectives that I mentioned earlier. What do we want to achieve here? But then in order to achieve them, actually, once you've figured out what you're up to, you need to have some starting points. Okay, where are we starting from? What are we like? What are our strengths, our weaknesses? Who are our friends, our allies? Who's our enemy, and what are they like? You have a whole set of assumptions that you need to work out. And then to get from your starting point to your objective, you can think of this sort of a pathway that you create called your plan. And that includes ways and means that you're going to use in order to go from your starting point off to your objective. Each piece of this I'm going to talk about in greater detail when we look at Al-Qaeda's grand strategy. And by the way, there's always this adjustment of assumptions along the way as well. You're always thinking, okay, what did we do right and wrong? Can we learn from this? And can we change things around so that we will be better at achieving our objective next time? Al-Qaeda is, above all else, a learning organization. And so it has gone through a tremendous evolution since its formation in 1988 to its current incarnation. And a lot of that shows this ability to adjust, to learn, and to evolve over time in reaction to what we've been doing and others have been doing in order to stop it. Before I begin, even though with Al-Qaeda, I need to ask an even more basic question. So how do you even know if our enemy, who is seeking to hide this from you, has a grand strategy? Well, sometimes you're very lucky, and you have an enemy who likes to talk a lot. So for instance, Adolf Hitler had a grand strategy that he was perfectly happy to talk about, and in fact to write an entire book about. Widely published, distributed everywhere. Unfortunately, hardly anybody read this book outside of Germany or paid attention to it or thought that anybody would be crazy enough to seek to achieve those sorts of objectives using those ways and means. And so it was ignored until far too late. In the same way, Al-Qaeda has been perfectly happy to talk about their grand strategy. In fact, they've published books. They've published huge statements, articles, in which they go into very great detail about what they hope to achieve and how they're going to go about achieving it. But not many people are paying attention to what the enemy itself is saying about what they want to achieve and how they're going to go about doing it. Tonight, I'm going to help you to see some of that through their own writings. The other way that you can please ignore any glitches with the technology. First of all, I have some sort of technology goblin that always follows me around. But secondly, I used a Mac to create this, and obviously we're using a PC, so they're having a little fight behind the scenes, Mac versus PC. The second way you can know if your enemy has a grand strategy through public statements, so speeches, lectures, and so on. And again, Al-Qaeda has been very willing to share in these sorts of statements, multiple statements, in fact, hundreds of statements since the 1990s about their grand strategy. The reason they've been so verbose is because they're hoping to convince people to join up with them. And they want to convince people that their objectives are sound, that they can be achieved, that their ways and means are things that you can support, and that we're starting from a very strong position with a firm idea about who we are and our enemy is that shows that we can achieve these objectives. So they've been happy to share this with us. But beyond this, you can also compare what people are saying with what they actually do. I mean, after all, somebody could just be a blowhard and out there spouting a whole bunch of nonsense, and they don't really mean to actually achieve all these things. So probably you should compare what the documents and statements say with what they're actually doing out there. And that's one piece of what I'm going to be doing tonight, is comparing what they say with what they're actually doing in order to see if there's any matchup between the two. And finally, if someone claims that they're going to achieve something on a global scale, a company is going to spread globally, open affiliates or branches all over the world, and they're going to have a uniform strategy that every single one of these affiliates will follow, then one would expect that you could look, in fact, all over the world in a global scale and say, okay, It's not just here in the United States they're doing this. They're also doing this in China. They're also doing this in Russia. Maybe they do actually have some sort of unified strategy on a global scale. On the other hand, if only one of the branches is actually doing what the group says or the company says is their strategy, and others are off there doing all sorts of wild and crazy things that don't follow the strategy, then you can probably have a little bit of skepticism about whether this is actually occurring on a global scale as they say it is. So keeping these all in mind, I'm now going to introduce you to Al-Qaeda's grand strategy and show just how fully articulated it is through their statements, their own statements and their own documents. Then secondly, I'm going to show how they've been following up on this with their own actions and on a global scale. So here's an overview. As you saw from that earlier diagram, I'm going to start with the beginning points or starting points that let us give a little bit of a look into the enemy's or the opponent's ideology, as well as their assumptions. The assumptions especially about themselves and about the people that they're going to be fighting with. Then I will take a look at their objectives that they hope to achieve, the means that they're using in order to achieve these objectives, and finally the plans or ways that they're using in order to put this all together to achieve their objectives. The basic ideological vision of Al-Qaeda is something that they've been happy to express from day one. You can go back to 1996 and one of the first statements put out by bin Laden. It's a very thick document. It's called a Declaration of Jihad on the United States. Most people know about the 1998 Declaration of Jihad, but that 1996 one was ignored. And I think that's because, first of all, it was too long for Americans. It was about 22 pages long. It had no bullet points. It was confusingly written. It started off talking about Saudi Arabia, and halfway through it was suddenly about the United States. And, here's most importantly, it was never translated into English. So most people didn't pay any attention to this statement of our objectives and what we hope to achieve. And one has to wonder who, in fact, this was written for, if it wasn't written for the United States. But in this document, as they do in nearly every statement that they put out, including a terrific book by a guy named Abu Bakr an-Neji, states that we have to create something called the caliphate, or an Islamic state, in order to correctly practice our version of Islam. Secondly, they believe that the entire world will eventually follow our version of Sharia and our version of Islam. Thirdly, they believe that they are the only true believers in the entire world, this tiny group of a few hundred and then later a few thousand people. All of those people who call themselves Muslims around the world are just so-called or nominal Muslims. They're not real Muslims like us. And in fact, they call themselves the saved sect or the victorious party in order to set themselves apart as this tiny little group that's guaranteed paradise, unlike the rest of Muslims, who may be going to paradise, but may also be going to hell. They also believe that hostile unbelievers control the entire world. The international system is under the control of these hostile unbelievers, and their main purpose in life is to prevent the creation of an Islamic state. You may not know this, but that has been the main purpose of U.S. foreign policy since day one, according to Al-Qaeda. Is to prevent the creation of an Islamic state. And they actually have entire histories written of the United States to prove that this is true. That's why war against us is justified. Because if we don't do something about the United States, we'll never be able to create this perfect state that is necessary in order to implement our extremist version of Sharia. Now, having given you that overview, I'm going to go through very quickly the basics of their grand strategy to show how they put that all together into a broader vision. So first of all, their starting points in their ideology are extremely important for that basic vision. They have 5 different concepts that are foundational for explaining why they are the saved sect, why their version of Sharia is the only right and true one, why other Muslims are not really real Muslims, but only they are, and so on and so forth. They begin with these 5 concepts, foundational concepts, and 4 of the 5 are also understood and have a sort of place within Islam as a whole. And I think that's why it's best in explaining these to put them out as a contrast so that you can see how ordinary Muslims think about these ideas and then contrast them with Al-Qaeda's views so you understand where they are at within the broader, bigger world of Islam. So most Muslims believe that Tawheed is the center and core of their entire religion. It states quite simply there is only one God and only He should be worshipped. That's usually called monotheism. I've seen it Tawheed very poorly translated as Unitarianism. I just think you get off on the wrong track there with that translation. But Tawheed is the center and core of Islam as a whole, as much as the notion of the Trinity is for Christianity. Al-Qaeda has taken this core principle and given it a twist. They say it's true, there's only one God, only He should be worshipped. But worship includes obedience to all of His laws, because God is the only lawgiver and the only one with sovereignty. This has 2 implications that other Muslims do not agree with. First and foremost, that if you don't obey all of God's laws, you're actually not really a Muslim. And then secondly, the second implication that Al-Qaeda draws is if God is the only lawgiver, the only one with sovereignty, anyone who attempts to make laws other than those that God has given us is not just making a political statement. They're not saying, I believe in democracy. They're actually making a statement about religion, that we believe in other divinities than God Himself. You're putting man in the place of God, who is the only lawgiver, right? Now, how do other Muslims, when they hear this, what do they think about this? Well, very simply, they think this is crazy talk. And they're happy to tell you that if you have a conversation with your Muslim friends or neighbors. How in the world can the notion that there is just one God lead you to the conclusion that democracy is a foreign religion, which is in fact an entire book written by one of Al-Qaeda's main ulama or clerics states that democracy is a foreign religion. It doesn't make sense to other Muslims. And the way I sometimes seek to explain it to my Christian friends is, it's as if somebody said the Trinity implies that you have to have 3 branches of government. Right? God the Father is the president. God the Son would be the legislature. And God the Holy Spirit inspiring all would be the... That's how crazy that sounds to other Muslims. And yet, this notion lies behind a lot of what Al-Qaeda is doing in the world today. This idea that democracy, that we cannot work through any democratic means in order to achieve our ends. To do so would be to leave the religion of Islam and to join a foreign religion. So they will never use a political system or a political way forward in order to achieve their ends. Because to do so would be to leave Islam in their view. The second notion is also extremely important for understanding their actions in the world today and their grand strategy as a whole. Dawah for most Muslims is about preaching to those who are outside of the faith in order to bring them in, to explain what the religion is like, why you should become a Muslim, how to become a Muslim. That's called dawah for most Muslims. And it's something that you sometimes will give money as charity in order to support. Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, has again taken this foundational concept and said, well, actually, dawah is about us seeking to convert other Muslims and turn them into real Muslims. That's how they put it. So dawah is not about having a conversation with non-Muslims. It's about targeting nominal Muslims, as they put it, in order to bring them into their fold and, first and foremost, to convince them to join in their violence, a violence they call jihad. And here's one of the ironies, and sad ironies, therefore, of a lot of charity that is given to groups that engage in dawah. Some of them, at least, not all of them, but some percentage of them, are in fact using that money in order to target you, the ordinary Muslim, and convince you to join up with extremist groups. The term Sharia is much in the news these days, and you've probably heard a lot about this, but probably one of the things that's not clear is that there is no set of books marked Sharia that one can take off of a shelf and understand what precisely this huge topic is about. Sharia is a legal system that has developed over 1,400 years. And it wouldn't include 30 volumes or 100 volumes in some sort of, legal corpus that's tightly bound, and all you have to do is take down volume 32 to understand, for instance, what inheritance means within Islam. It includes, in fact, hundreds of thousands of volumes over 1,400 years. It includes 4 schools of law that fight with each other over all sorts of issues within the Sunni tradition, and the Shia tradition has their own schools of law. It includes a huge amount of tafsir, of commentary and interpretation that would take, frankly, a lifetime to understand and explain. So for most Muslims, Sharia has the connotation of justice or morality. And for most Muslims, it doesn't have specifics attached to it. It's more about living a just or moral life. And so when I see very poorly worded polls that are taken out in the Muslim majority world saying things like, would you like to have Sharia implemented in your country? And people say yes. I think that is the worst way possible to ask that question. What you've just asked is, do you believe in morality? And the answer is obviously going to be yes, right? People are not going to say. But for most Muslims, then there are very few specifics attached to Sharia. It's an ethical system in some ways more than about specifics. And it's also key to the religion, living that moral life. So Sharia is about obeying God's laws, as I understand them, and being a moral person. If you don't do that, well, maybe you're not such a good Muslim, but you're still a Muslim. And by the way, it's not up to me to correct my neighbor and tell them, by the way, you're not living a moral life. You should, shape up. Al-Qaida has a very different view. The only place they agree is that Sharia is the entire religion. Beyond that, they say, actually, we think there are 30 volumes, and we have written them for you. Here they are. This is what Sharia is, this specific version and nothing else. And you are going to be forced to follow it or else. Because if you won't obey our version of Sharia, this very extremist version, then we believe we have to correct you. It's not up to God, it's up to us to do it. And finally, the concept known as wala wal bara'a. This is based on 2 terms, allegiance and disavowal. It's sometimes called friendship and enmity, or other ways that it's been translated. This concept basically says that everyone who is with us, who agrees with us completely, follows our Sharia, believes in our ideas about Tawheed and Dawah, they are our people, and we will support and have friendship with them. But anyone who disagrees with us, including so-called Muslims, as well as the unbelievers, we have to have eternal enmity and separation from them and have nothing to do with them, in fact. This leads to something called takfir, that is declaring other Muslims to not really be Muslims. And this has implications within their version of Sharia that are quite severe. Your blood becomes halal, that is, you can be killed. All of your property can be taken away. You are divorced. You are disinherited. You become, in fact, a non-person. That is what Al-Qaida has been doing to the vast majority of the Muslim majority world. And by the way, this concept, I cannot put up 2 columns here because it is completely unacceptable to ordinary Muslims. Now, if you'll notice, one of the things that stands out from their ideology is the vast majority of it is, in fact, aimed at other Muslims and is not aimed at non-Muslims at all. And it's, in fact, a theme that I think you will see throughout their entire ideology. Justifying an attack on the United States was, in fact, the biggest leap and the biggest jump for them, since their entire vision is taking over the religion of Islam and twisting it for their own purposes and means, forcing other Muslims, whether they want to or not, to follow their version of Sharia, following other Muslims to follow their vision of the religion. And this explains, I think, just to make one implication for you, some of the things you may have been reading about in the newspapers, what has been happening to Muslims in northern Mali, for instance, or in Syria, or Yemen, or Somalia, or any place where Al-Qaeda has attempted to implement its vision of the world. First and foremost, it's about transforming other Muslims and transforming Islam. Now, this plays a lot of this vision of themselves as transformers, as people who are going to renew the religion into their own image, can be seen in their self-image as well. But they have another view of themselves as the high command of a global jihad that is more specific and has developed since 9/11. Before 9/11, they talked about themselves as a vanguard, as a group that were going to charge ahead and others would follow us, who were going to show people what Islam should be, and we would be imitated. But since 9/11, they've actually changed the way they talk about themselves, no longer depending on others to follow them, but going to command people, to order people to do what they want, and to have forces on the ground that they call branches or regions who will do our bidding and act as our hands and feet out there in the world. This vision of themselves is divided into two pieces, a high command and as branches or as regions, is reflected in current thinking in Washington today. You see this language, I am sure, of the core and affiliates, Al-Qaeda's core and Al-Qaeda's affiliates. And this is, I think, a reflection of the language that is used by Al-Qaeda itself in talking about what it is and what is up to. But the terms core and affiliate do not get at the functionality of the terms high command and branches, because the way Al-Qaeda sees it is there is a command who is ordering people around, whether they obey them or not is another question, and out in the field, these branches are organically part of us, not somehow separated, not something different. They're organically part of us and working with us in order to achieve our grand strategy. They also have a series of assumptions that flow from their ideology. Their assumptions are, as I said, from their vision, that the main purpose of the enemy, that is us and our allies, is to prevent the establishment of an Islamic State. And as I said, they've written entire books in order to explain the history of the United States through this lens, beginning with the fight against the Barbary pirates. That's apparently when the United States started. There's no history before then. Right through the foundation of Israel and then the unprovoked attack on the Taliban after 9/11. They don't think that 9/11, in fact, caused the attack on the Taliban. The center of gravity for this enemy, in their assumption, is public support and the economic system. This is also a development since 9/11 and shows some interesting learning on their part. Before 9/11, they believed that the U.S. was a paper tiger and a media mirage that really had nothing behind it, and that all you had to do is carry out a few attacks like 9/11, and the U.S. would run for it. Since 9/11, they've changed their minds somewhat, and they see this as a longer-term battle in order to get rid of the United States from their lands, and they're using attrition especially in order to carry out this vision, as we shall see later. Their assumptions about the war are also quite telling. They believe that this is an existential fight, not something that is a limited war or something that really they have any choice about. They believe the war is about the very existence of Islam, and they've made it all about a war on Islam. So in this existential fight, there can be no bystanders. You're either with us or you're against us, in their terminology. It is a total war by us against them and by them on us. And through this, by the way, they justify a lot of the means that I'll talk about later on. When they think about their enemies, they divide them up, however, into 4 separate categories. all of whom have the same purpose, to destroy Islam, all of whom have these weak spots that they can exploit, but against whom they'll have to devise different strategies. Here's how they view us. We're the Jews and Crusaders, sometimes very poorly translated as the Jewish Crusaders. I just think that's wrong as well. The Jews and Crusaders and their allies are the biggest threat, and the one that has to be dealt with first, because they have the means to stop us and have been trying to stop us for hundreds of years from implementing this vision. That's their concept. So we must get rid of them first if we want to carry on and attack our second enemy, the so-called apostate rulers, that is, the rulers of every single Muslim-majority country. In their view, these guys are puppets, agents. They have no real agency of their own. And the only thing that's holding them up is the United States. So if they get rid of the United States, convince us to leave them alone, we'll be able to take on and defeat the apostate rulers easily. The Shia will be an ultimate enemy, the ones we'll take on third after we've dealt with all of these apostate rulers. And in fact, in a very interesting letter that he wrote to Zarqawi, Zawahiri says, eventually we'll have to come to blows with the Shia state. Everybody knows that, just as we'll eventually have to destroy the Jewish state. But for now, the way we should be dealing with the Shia is to understand them as two groups. They're the sheep, the ordinary Shia, who have to be put into re-education camps, and their leaders, who must be all killed off. That's their view of the Shia. And finally, they have a very large group of people who must either convert to their version of Islam, their extremist version of Islam, or face death. So all Hindus must convert or die. All Alawis. In fact, one of their leaders put out a statement about 6 months ago in which he said, don't ask for another fatwa to kill the Alawis. They all need to die. The Druze and others who they consider to be polytheist also will be given the choice of conversion or death. And they're in the process of implementing these genocidal ideas in places like Syria today. So I used to think about Al-Qaeda, the analogy I had in my head was sort of, the Bolsheviks or the Cold War. This sort of small conspiratorial group hoping to take over a state and then carry out this ideologically driven vision of the world of world conquest. Now I think of them, however, as the Nazis, because their vision is so driven by this view that there are real human beings and subhumans, real humans who follow only our version of Islam and everyone else in the world, and also by a sort of genocidal view of the world that I don't think of them any longer as the cold and rational Bolsheviks, but rather as this very wild and crazy, passionate Nazis. So what are their objectives? Well, for their grand strategic purposes, this is how they have stated them over and over and over again. First, we're going to get rid of all the non-Muslim occupiers, which include, by the way, all of their so-called Muslim, as they put it, rulers of the Muslim-majority world. And by the way, how do they define occupation? Well, just on the surface, one would think that they were talking about military occupation, right? But in fact, when they define it, they specifically list ambassadors and all diplomats, tourists, businessmen, anyone, in fact, who's non-Muslim or not their kind of Muslim, as they would put it, has to be removed from our countries. Secondly, a second objective is to impose their extremist version of Sharia and force all Muslims to follow this. Thirdly, set up Islamic governance, institutions that they're in the process of creating right now in places like Syria. Create the caliphate somehow out of this Islamic governance. And finally, what they call make God's word the highest, which means a lot of things to other Muslims. Uphold the glory of Islam, prevent Islam from seeing shame or something like that is, I think, how most Muslims understand this term. But for Al-Qaeda, what it means is we will force the entire world to follow our version of Sharia. That's the objectives and ends that they've put forward. And the means that they're going to do it are these. They believe that attacking America has to happen in order to achieve greater ends. It's a means, in other words, to greater ends. Inciting the entire Ummah to join that community of Muslims, to join up with us. Now you may be asking yourself, who is going to be attracted to this vision when they are clearly told, unless you agree with every single point of our ideology, you're not really a Muslim? Well, this explains something that has been puzzling, I think, to others when looking at this group. Who actually joins Al-Qaeda is actually not what you might expect. The vast majority of those who are attracted to the group are extremely young, have absolutely no background in religious studies. In fact, most of them don't speak Arabic or read the Quran in the original languages. In fact, they're attracted to this because the arguments that are made fall apart when they are put before those who do have that sort of religious knowledge. So anyone who has some sort of serious background in religion has a little bit of immunization against Al-Qaeda's arguments. And those who don't are the ones who actually are attracted and join up with the religion, join up with this particular group. Fighting jihad. Jihad and jihad alone are the way forward. We cannot use some sort of political process. And we will unify the ranks. We will bring all of these diverse jihadist or fighting groups out there into our orbit. And they have a very interesting way of doing this, an entire strategy, in fact, for doing this. And I'm happy to discuss if you'd like to hear. But this explains, I just wrote an entire piece on this. This explains how they were able to take over the fighting in Iraq when Al-Qaeda started off as a very tiny minority of all the groups there, how they were able to take over the fighting in Syria when they started off as a minority group there. Mali, Yemen, and Somalia are also great examples of them starting off as a minority group and taking them over. That's what they call unifying the ranks in order to make themselves in charge of this global jihad. Commanding right and forbidding wrong is what they do in order to force people to follow their version of Sharia. And finally, setting up shadow governance, creation of institutions in order to create the state, that Islamic state that they believe is necessary. Now, allow me to just briefly show you the difference between ends and means and how Al-Qaeda has, in fact, had them match up rather perfectly here. So, removing the occupation, here's the means that they're using in order to achieve that end. Imposing their version of Sharia, here's what they've actually been doing in order to achieve that. Creating Islamic governance, they have these emirs, these commanders that they set up, and other rulers. They're taxing people. They set up recruitment stations in order to draft people. They just set up one, in fact, in a major city in Syria in order to force people in. And they're also creating a regular army. One of the most horrifying things you can do is go on YouTube these days and take a look at Al-Qaeda videos, which are freely available all over the place. And many of them deal with their tank armies, their armored forces in places like Syria and Yemen that they're putting together in order to challenge the states of Yemen and Syria. And finally, eternal jihad with the unbelievers. I said they're foreseeing a 200-year war, but that's just with the U.S. and all of these occupation forces, as they put them. Beyond that, they think that they're going to be engaged in a war until the end of time in order to conquer the world for their version of Sharia. And here are their plans. And this might be all the further that I get this evening, but I would like to show you a map that I have that shows where they believe that they're at in this war. Their plans take these means and seek to apply them to achieve their ends. And they begin with a stage of preparation and training, one that's very similar, in fact, to the Maoist concept of a sort of preparing for war, not letting people know that you're actually doing so, training in order to later come out in the open with open warfare. So, for instance, the 1990s, most of us know that they were preparing attacks on the United States because they actually did it, right? But what most people don't know is that 99% of their money was being spent on training mujahideen to go back and start jihads all over the Muslim-majority world. So 99% of their effort was not about attacking the United States at all. It was about carrying out warfare in the Muslim-majority world. Stage 2, begin pushing America and its allies out of our land and encourage what they call hijra, that is a migration by what we call foreign fighters, in order to come in and fight against the United States. Thirdly, impose Sharia with our hisba, that's the other term they use for commanding right and forbidding wrong, and our courts. They're setting those up right now in places like Syria, all over Syria. Stage 4, begin guerrilla warfare. Now, you can see in Syria, these were out of order. How do I know that they put stage 3 before stage 4 and that that's out of order in Syria? Because actually they published this great book called The Management of Savagery, in which they describe precisely how they were going to go about doing this. And if you take a look at other places like Yemen or Somalia or many other places across the Sahel, they are in fact following this order rather than the way that it occurred in Syria. So what happened in Syria was actually an adjustment of what is an overall strategy. And finally, manage savagery, that's what it's called in this book, by setting up institutions that will basically take the place of the government, so that the government will eventually find itself simply displaced across huge tracts of land. Then you unify all the people who are fighting in order to declare what they call an imara, which means an authority or a command that later will become the kernel for the state. When you've overthrown the apostate and you've seized the state, you actually have all the institutions already created up and running in order to take over and begin running your own state. And, by the way, then you work across borders. To them, borders are meaningless. They were set up by their enemies in order to confine them and their spread. And they have declared that they're going to spread across these borders and have, in fact, begun to do so. Stage 9 is the creation of the caliphate, and that sort of just hangs out there. That's because they haven't gotten to this stage yet, and I have a feeling they don't quite know what that means yet. I certainly have seen no discussion of how precisely we're going to go about creating this nearly global state. And finally, there'll be all-out war with the unbelievers until the end of time, a confrontation that they believe will end with the return of the Mahdi and Jesus. Yes, and Jesus, right? The end times, the thinking about the end times is very interesting, but it includes the return of Jesus, who will convert everyone to Islam. So how well are they doing? Here's their map of the world from what they say and what they talk about and how they've organized themselves. In their vision of things, they believe that they're doing quite well. We understand this differently. We say, well, at least we haven't had a major attack on the United States since 9/11, and thank goodness for it. But in their view, that was always about getting us out. And haven't we withdrawn from Iraq? Aren't we about to leave Afghanistan? So it's on to everything else, which wasn't about us at all. My view of Al-Qaeda has shifted so considerably since 2003, 2004, when I wrote my first book on this topic. I still thought it was about us. But now I understand. Al-Qaeda's grand strategy is primarily about other Muslims. It's primarily about the rest of the world and not about us at all. My fear is we'll keep ourselves safe, but at the cost of losing the rest of the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We're open for questions. Eli will run around with the microphone. Please speak directly into the mic.
aren't all the Muslim countries of the world and the Muslims in the U.S. and Muslims in Mali and so forth terrified of them?
Yes.
Don't they
Yes.
Don't they want to get together and destroy them?
Yes. Actually, could you put up that last slide? Because I actually have, in pursuit of another project that I'm deeply involved in, a 2 to 3 year project to devise a strategy for combating Al-Qaeda. I've put together a 4x4 square in order to divide up countries, how well they're doing against Al-Qaeda. And if you take a look around the Muslim majority world, the vast majority are still able to combat Al-Qaeda. They're still, keeping them down to a terrorist group instead of an insurgency. So, for instance, I'm sorry about this. Oh, wait. I've been standing there thinking. Okay. So, for instance, Turkey is tremendously effective against Al-Qaeda, as is Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Mauritania, Niger. Obviously, Somalia's having terrible problems, but Kenya and Tanzania are also very effective. Out here, they've hardly made any inroads at all. Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, and they're doing fantastic in their fight against Al-Qaeda. But you can see the places where I haven't, and by the way, Russia, through sheer attrition, has managed to keep it down to a terrorist sort of threat. But there are whole tracts of land here, mostly in the very center of the map, where we're doing much worse today than we were after 9/11. So what they call Khorasan is in really bad shape. Even though the vast majority of the people there are fighting as hard as they can, they simply don't have the capacity to defeat these guys. And in fact, if you look around, I have, in this 4x4 thing, I have capable and willing as the two criteria, right? And since 2010, almost all of these countries have become willing to fight Al-Qaeda. They're not. The number that are unwilling is minuscule, right? Almost everybody wants to do it. It's the capacity that's the problem in other places where they're doing better. Oh, wait, okay.
Hi.
Sorry.
It seems to me that you define Al-Qaeda with a very broad brush that could be used to define almost every religious extremist group throughout history, whether it was the Zealots in Israel killing Jews who were non-believers or weren't believer enough, or in the Inquisition when the Christians would kill Jews or other groups because they didn't believe in the right things, or even today the Sunni extremists who would kill the Shia extremists. I think we're talking about a group that we call Al-Qaeda because it had a very charismatic leader, and they did some horrible things that got everybody's memory, and they stuck there. But I think you're just defining, to a great extent, religious extremism from whatever group to whatever group.
On the one hand, I do agree with you that extremist groups in general, whether they're politically, ideologically extreme or religiously extreme, do share some characteristics. So, for instance, one way that I also think about Al-Qaeda is as a sort of marginal sect, right? A cult that, as with many cults, requires you to disavow your family and leave them, and nobody's pure enough or good enough. You have to cut off all communication with them and go on. There's many ways that one can understand it, but every ideology or every extremist group also has very, very specific things about it that define them as different from other extremist groups. So, for instance, if I were going to define Bolshevism, one could do it by the leadership, but How would you define it then after the death of Lenin? What happened to communism after that was it didn't go away, and it still retained the same objectives, many of the same means. Some of those changed a little bit, many of the same strategies and visions of what they wanted to achieve. So in the same way, the views that Al-Qaeda holds are absolutely unique to it and are not those that were ever shared by anybody else. In fact, in the 1990s, they had huge arguments with other extremist groups who said, you're crazy to believe these things and we don't accept you. They almost wouldn't accept Zarqawi because Zarqawi wouldn't agree with them on one point, that is on wala wal bara'a. Saif al-Adl, who was the head of intelligence for Al-Qaeda at the time, put together this quite nice public, discussion of the negotiations he went through with Zarqawi. And this is back in, I think it was published in 2005. And he talks about the fact that we almost couldn't come to an agreement with him because he wouldn't budge on his definition of wala wal bara'a. So we almost had to let him go. So while it's true that many extremist groups share a lot of different points or characteristics that one can point to, in this case, we can be very, very specific about their beliefs, about their objectives, about their strategies, in a way that literally no other group shares with them. The big argument is whether the affiliates, and I put this up as one of the discussions that is going on right now in policy circles in Washington, is what is the exact relationship between the leadership, that's often Afghanistan, Pakistan somewhere, and the affiliates, as we generally call them. Al-Qaeda never calls them affiliates. Its term for them is, as I said, branches. And these are how they draw the branches. So to them, it's a regional, it's a geographical thing as well as a group thing, right? And I suppose, but here I have no proof, I suppose that they would think of these as being regions within the caliphate eventually. And here, by the way, you'll notice that there's a small lacuna right here. It's because I don't know what they call them until recently. They actually came up with a new group called the Murabitun that includes that area of the world. I didn't know what they were called, though, or how they envisioned that part of the world until very recently. So you have to wait sometimes for them to publicly declare things before you can figure out what their views are. Now, having said that their images, that they're branches, the term they use to describe the relationship is udwiya, which means it's like an organic membership, right? Like a branch is part of a tree. It makes up a tree, or an arm is part of your body, right? That's how they envision it. But that doesn't mean that it always works out 100% the way they would like it to. So I've given you their vision. I've given you what they're seeking to achieve, and we can point to places where they actually are achieving it. But they do have problems. They do have arguments. There is splintering that occurs. There's infighting that happens. That's the way actually it is in most irregular wars, though, right? Where there's how in the world would you keep something this big together on a global scale, right? So there is this kind of fighting going on that I think we can exploit and use to our own advantage. I don't want to make it sound like they always get everything their way. In fact, they don't.
Well, hi, thank you very much. This is a very helpful layout. I've not seen that before. You don't have to say now, but that must go back some years, that carving up into zones. I think probably one of the hardest things to grasp is that we have minority Muslim groups in England, France, Germany, the U.S., and that sort of thing. Except for tiny minorities, whether it's 9/11, virtually none of them really went very public or expressed particular moral outrage. I'm so impressed still with I don't even know what segment of Islam did it, who walked in a kind of a burqa as a man with tons of explosives on his body and walked in 2004 in a Baghdad toy bazaar with only women and children and blew himself up and killed 300 mothers and 400 children. I was not aware of any protest. I was not aware of any protest when the only Christian minister in Pakistan who was riding in his car, was attacked by one man, murdered in the middle of one of the major Pakistani cities, and carried around on the shoulders of 5,000 people as a hero. I was not aware of anything that happened to the killing of 60 Shiites recently, in the past year, in Pakistan. I'm not aware that Pakistan or even the West paid attention to the fact that within a week after the destruction in Korea, 90 Christians were destroyed in Pakistan. So I want to ask a larger question. For the breadth of Islam, are all humans equal? Therefore, what is the real meaning that really seems to underlie everything? That there are truly dhimis, either of human essence or spiritual essence, and therefore those that are of dhimis can quite readily be approached and treated with taqiyya, which you might then explain.
Yeah. So that's a sort of multi-part question. Let me give you the easier part, and then I'll deal with the more difficult part. The easier part is, why don't you hear more protests? I highly recommend memory.org, actually. They used to only do sort of the words of extremists. And if you wanted to get translations of what Al-Qaida was saying, you could go to them and you could find it. But sometime in 2005, 2006, they realized that there was another problem going on, that people were not hearing the voices of liberals and liberal Muslims and Muslims who disagreed with Al-Qaida. And they created a section of their website that does translations of what ordinary Muslims have to say about this, and also what ordinary ulema are issuing fatwas about and saying about this. And it's huge. It's full of protests and fatwas and arguments against the extremists. So I highly recommend, rather than listening to me talk about it, that you go to memory.org. You might actually have to join up, but there's tons of translated stuff here. The problem I think we have is, one, hardly any of us, speak and read Arabic, Urdu, all the languages that are necessary in order to be able to see this. And secondly, if it bleeds, it leads. Our newspapers tend to focus on violence rather than on protest against the violence. So, for instance, after Benghazi, there was a huge protest by the residents of Benghazi against the murder of our ambassador. I don't know if any of you saw that. Yeah, it was huge. Tens of thousands of, some people say hundreds of thousands of people protested in the streets about that. And here's what happened to them later. Al-Qaeda in that town made a list, I suppose, and checked it twice, and went around and shot 50 of the leaders. That's what they do in order to prevent people from protesting even. So sometimes the reason you don't hear things is because of the murder and intimidation that's going on in these countries. So that's the sort of easier piece of this. The second piece, though, has to do with the nature of Islam, which is, wow, is that a huge topic? And that's that was my original interest in the 1990s. I was actually interested in what's called fiqh, which is jurisprudence, and Islamic history and theology. So I was not interested in the extremists back in the 1990s. For some reason, after 9/11, I was like, oh, look. So maybe one of the ways to explain this is that the concept of ijma is extremely important for understanding Islam. That is consensus. Whatever the consensus of the scholars, or in some interpretations, the consensus of the community is, that is what Islam is. So the consensus of the community and of the elites and of the scholars for about 80 years was a very modernist vision of Islam. And throughout the 20th century, that vision won out. And it explains why you have the foundation and support and educational systems that were very secular in places like, well, everywhere from Algeria, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Turkey, wherever you can name it, right through Iran and Pakistan, right? And but that consensus began to break down after 1967 and 1973. And those defeats left a door open for the Islamists, who began to make another argument that what we need is not a modernist vision, but we need to go back to real Islam as we understand it. And throughout the 1970s, that vision has been winning more and more people over to it. So I think the 80s and 90s kind of pushed it even further because so many of those societies failed, right? They failed to thrive, to create economic success, to create liberty and freedoms. And one by one, those countries began to have larger and larger numbers of people who began to argue we need to have a more purist vision of what our religion is. But even there's huge disagreements about what constitutes, real Islam. So it's not as if that vision is one thing. What is troublesome to me is that some people seem to be agreeing with Al-Qaida that this vision of Islam is the real vision. And that's dangerous, and it's just wrong. It encourages that consensus to move in the wrong direction, and it denigrates the beliefs of the vast majority of the Muslim majority world. So to me, that's one of the major reasons to avoid thinking about these guys as somehow more authentic. That's certainly what they think, but it's not what the vast majority of the Muslim world thinks.
We have time for one more.
One short question, one short answer.
What can you discern about the normal path to leadership? What is the succession plan?
That's funny you should mention that, because one of the things that was most noticeable in the documents that were released a year and a half ago from the Abbottabad cache is there's a huge discussion about deputies. First deputies, second deputies, I don't know, maybe there's even third and fourth deputies. Perhaps in reaction to the strategy we've chosen over the past few years to combat them, that is attrition. They've adjusted by just creating a whole mess of deputies. You kill off one and deputy number one's up on the firing squad, or you kill off him, deputy number two pops up. They have a very well articulated succession strategy. And a tremendous amount of resilience has been built in, unfortunately. I wish it were just as simple as having, 100 faces they put red X's through and it would all go away. But in fact, it has multiplied beyond a terrorist problem. It's become an insurgency problem, and it is impossible to kill your way out of an insurgency.